It's poverty.
It's crime.
Unemployment.
Corruption.
Accountability.
The energy crisis.
Inflation. We are worried.
That South Africa has myriad problems on all fronts is a given. But the time has come for us to look for real solutions. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and this Moneyweb podcast will discuss those solutions on how South Africans can solve problems by having tough conversations and drawing on the insights of South Africa's top business leaders. Welcome to Fix SA. Hello everybody, I'm Jeremy Maggs, where every fortnight we ask our guests how we can make things a little better in this country. How do we improve matters? How in the shortest space of time can we become a competitive and successful nation once again? And my special guest this week is Dr. Miriam Altman, a South African economist. She's a social activist and also a strategist. I'm not going to go into her full biography, but very briefly has served as an executive director at the Human Sciences Research Council, chief of strategy and regulatory affairs, if memory serves, at Telkom, and also a commissioner on the National Planning Commission in the Office of the President. You'll know that's the body tasked with guiding long-term planning for South Africa. Dr. Altman is also a professor of Fourth Industrial Revolution practice in the School of Economics at the University of Johannesburg and an adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town. And that's enough CV as far as I'm concerned. Miriam, such a pleasure to talk to you. A very warm welcome. And I'm going to ask you to take your pick as we start this conversation. What's the biggest problem in South Africa right now, in your opinion, that needs fixing?
You might be surprised by what I say, but the absolutely most important thing for us is that we should be investing in human capability. That probably sounds like a tall order and maybe abstract, but it is, I think, the most important ingredient to success in any high-growth developing country, and it's something that we underplay so significantly in South Africa. I think it's the reason we don't progress.
So when you're talking about investing in that capability, are you talking about a bottom-up approach where we further enhance the skills of people that are here, or do we need to start importing those skills that we lack?
Well, no doubt, one of the most important ways of growing, expanding, developing is to have easy movement of people between countries. There's no doubt about that. So we should definitely be enabling that kind of skilled immigration that we often talk about. But we've got plenty of capability in the country also. So let me go to the most narrow kind of example that I can give. The capability in state-owned enterprise that I know you want to talk about a bit in this call, the quality of the boards and experience, the quality of executive management, their stability is absolutely key to everything else functioning. When I went to Telkom, you're right, I was chief of strategy at Telkom for the turnaround. I was brought in by Sipho Maseko. I was his first hire in the company. I knew him quite well. I went to Telkom knowing that it was failing. It was in a failing situation. I joined in 2013 with Sipho. For me, what I've learned is that the most important thing in anything, it's not just being part of something exciting change, it's the quality of the leadership. And what had happened at Telkom was that in 2012, for whatever, I don't know why, but the board suddenly was appointed in, and it was a very high quality board. And, you had Santi Butta. It was a very strong board. And then Sipho, I knew from Vodacom, he's a very strong character and super smart. And for me, that was enough to tell me that there was a chance of succeeding. And that's what happened, that we were really able to drive the change. And it doesn't matter what the detail is, but you've got the characters who are eating, sleeping, dreaming, and with the capability to do it. And we just don't take that seriously enough. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'll stop there, is simply this issue. Can kids read? That's the bigger ticket, broader set of issues is if there's one thing that, say, the next president needs to pin his presidency on the way that General Park did in the 1950s in Korea, is that every child should be able to read for meaning by age 10 or by grade 2. That would be an absolute game changer. You could rally the whole nation around it. Every single person can be involved in something like that.
I want to circle back to SOEs, Miriam, and I'm glad that you've raised that. I absolutely understand the notion of quality leadership. I want to push you on that in just a moment. But with so many SOEs, there is the sense of despondency and inertia that prevails right across the value chain within an organization. How do you start overcoming that to then turn this big ship around?
So it's an interesting thing so the first thing, you do need the quality of leadership. You need people who are in place for a long time, and you need to be able to drive performance. Now, in some of the entities like Eskom and Transnet, you're starting to see the change in the quality of management. The question is, how is performance driven? Now, if you take the telecom example, it was very strange when I joined, certainly. You could see that one of the problems in the company, even though it is in a competitive market and was that people still had this idea like they were in a monopoly. And so I used to run war games in the company and so on to get people to understand that this is actually a competitive environment. It's a very, very interesting thing. Now, the SOEs and then government departments also, they're not in competitive markets, and that becomes a huge problem. So when Eskom, for example, sets up a transmission company, it'll be something like what we had to do at Telkom, where we broke up our wholesale and retail businesses. I don't know if that makes sense to your listeners. Yeah. So they used to fuel each other and protect each other. And we said to each of them, you become profit centers and you have to be profitable on your own, however you achieve that. You're not now protecting other parts of the business. And the idea was to light a fire under people's bum and to open up the opportunity. Now, in Eskom, once there is more competitive procurement of generation, of power, that will start to change, and that you're not protecting Eskom anymore. That's not what your goal is. Then you're going to see a very different kind of behavior, I think. So they really need to get moving, which they are, with that transmission company. Then we need to start seeing in which Minister Ramokgopa, to his credit, has been doing, is around transmission infrastructure has been a huge issue for many years. And as you know, in bid window 6, and if I need to explain anything that I'm saying, I'm happy to do that. But in bid window 6, in renewables procurement, as you know, they didn't take on any of the wind projects, which was unbelievable. And they said it was because there wasn't any transmission infrastructure, which is it's just beyond imagination. So, the point is the fact that he's pushing extremely hard on that now, because Eskom's been pushing on it for years, I got to tell you. So now he's pushing on that. And then what he's been doing is he's been trying to look at innovation in public-private cooperation around transmission finance. So he had an event last year that I was at. It was a closed event where he had Goldman Sachs and a variety of other financial institutions who were presenting ideas on how transmission infrastructure could be financed, and he seems to be pushing that quite hard.
Miriam, you've raised two interesting points. One is lighting the fire under the bum, which might just give me a headline for this conversation. And the second is how to keep people in place for a longer period of time. Let's start with the fire quotient first. What do you mean by that? Is it no carrot and all stick, or what's the strategic approach?
So when we went into telecom, the design of the narrative, and this was a specific choice, I'm giving this as an example, there's a tendency, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector also, that you go into a failing company and you think you're smarter than everybody, and you go in with a big heavy stick and you treat people like they're stupid and they don't know anything, but actually they know everything. So when a company's failing, the discussion I had with SIPO when I joined was you have to assume that the problem is the top leadership and not them. If everybody's failing and the whole company's failing, it's probably not the staff. It's the incentives that were laid out for them, the KPIs, the ability to drive behavior, feedback loops, all that kind of thing. And it was very true at telecom. So we started with that assumption that you can't fix a company that's very sort of customer facing as a company like telecom is, and then think that you're smarter than everybody. People who've been in the company for like 40 years. Sometimes their fathers worked there. Their grandfathers worked for the post office, They really love the company and know it, but feel so angry that they're not being enabled. Now, that is the story that I was sure was behind the scenes at Eskom, and that's what's coming through now. In that Treasury report that was commissioned, I forget the name of it, that German company that did that report, They felt exactly the same thing. I just assumed that that's what it was. And that's what I assumed when I went to telecom. And that was exactly what it was, is that there's lots of things you need to do that are outward to earn more revenue and market orientated. But there's a whole lot of stuff just around customer service and reliable connectivity that we're now finding at the plant level in ESCOM. You have to assume that it's something like that.
But you have to be firm and resolute, and make sure that very strict KPIs are designed and adhered to, and possibly that's what you probably mean, I'm assuming, by lighting the fire.
Well, okay, so I'll give you another example from telecom, because I think it's quite a good example, because we move fast, eh? Like, I don't know if you remember, but I had in mind that I wanted people to be able to see the financials change by the mid-year results. I joined in June or July, and our mid-year results were in October, and I wanted it to be clear so people would start believing in the storyline that things were going to improve. That was part of the strategy, and it did. We saved about 700-800 million rand on our OPEX, and it showed in the mid-year results. That's how fast the change happened. And it happened through this process, if I can just summarize, of picking the big ticket items, obviously, that could have a big impact, working out, mobilizing the staff around them, making them the center point, not the consultants, making them the center point and empowering them to do stuff, shifting the performance incentives around that, because a lot of the KPIs were just not correctly set, actually. They encouraged the wrong behavior. And then shifting the financial, like the bonus structure, because people would be paid for staying and for breathing. And we got rid of all that stuff. And we elevated group and individual performance incentives, which SOEs don't tend to have. A government struggles with that idea, which is like unbelievable. So we had to motivate to introduce them. It was quite a big fight about it, but we introduced that. And then in the change program, I brought up engineers from the company to work in my office. For people who were directly involved in the change process, I worked with our accountants to line up the finances directly to results. And that enabled me. And then I had a team in my office who could tell me when there were red flags, when something wasn't going wrong and people weren't telling me. And then we would work with people. We wouldn't treat them like crap and tell them they're stupid. We would say, look, you're not going to get your bonus this year. They were used to getting bonuses anyway for breathing. And Santi Bhutto that's what I was referring to her. She was the head of the REMCO. And I can tell you, she's a bulldog. So she's tough, eh?
Yeah, those of us who have met Santi Bhutto can certainly attest to that. Dr. Altman, so that's the one side of it. It's the empathy side. But I'm also going to assume that your argument is predicated on continuity. And that brings me to the second part of that question about keeping key people in the job for an extended period of time.
Right.
Because there is so much movement, and that movement leads to, I think there's a word called discontinuity, and that's a problem.
Well, so before we leave the last topic, I want to say very clearly, it's got to be carrots and sticks. There has to be a threat of non-performance and what happens, and it has to be meaningful. And there should be an upside to good performance as well. People get a lot of pride from it, so it's not just the money. So at both those things, and respect and drawing staff who probably know more than you do, into the design of the change. So just before we move on. Now, in terms of continuity, of course, you have to hope that you've got someone who's good, of course. At telecom, people were paid retention bonuses, which means that we paid them to stay. And my view is if you want to go, go. We're not paying you to stay. You can get an incredible bonus if you achieve targets. Then be paid very handsomely. And so, but the problem that arises, and I've had this experience, I've worked in a lot of public sector, major programs and institutions, and I find that just like constant change of the goalposts, constant change of the leadership. So you can't get a team in motion because people have to, even ordinary people or even people who maybe aren't great at their job, but are willing to do it, can at least get into motion and understand what the routines are. The problem that's arising right now across government is that the routines are breaking down, and big bureaucracies and even big companies are actually bureaucracies, in fact. The majority of people need to know what you want from them, and then you just have to regularize that, and then they just know how to do their job. Most jobs aren't like creative. but you need some regularity, and you can't keep changing the rules of the game and what's expected, and people can't cope with that stuff and they get demoralized.
Let's talk about the new rules of the game if we can, as I want to pivot the conversation away from state-owned enterprises and the work that you do in 4IR. You will obviously tell me that digital readiness is critical for South Africa's future, but
Sure.
we're way behind the curve from what I can discern. What immediate steps can we take to improve it?
Well, again, it's funny because I was just talking to, there's this incredible company called Arise that is investing in financial institutions across Africa, and I was giving a keynote address on this very thing. And it's a range of things. Firstly, governments tend to not understand digital very well, and that's partly because governments are bureaucratic and digital is ever-changing. So there's a number of things. I was raising this point about human capability. We need a population that is e-enabled, like the way that a place like Vietnam, I'm giving Vietnam as an example. China is a very good example, but Vietnam is maybe a better example, or Malaysia, where there's been, because they're lower income countries, much lower than us, certainly Vietnam is. They made an objective choice very early, like 10 or 15 years ago, that everybody should be connected and everybody should have a kind of digital awareness and everybody should have access to affordable broadband. And everybody does, and it really shows. It's very affordable, very accessible. You know, when you go to Vietnam, I was there before COVID anyway, and, you know, you walk through the door. I arrived at like 10 o'clock at night. I walked into a store. As soon as I got to my hotel, I had broadband on my phone straight away. It was like cost almost nothing, even as a foreigner, and I was already off and away. And China's like that as well.
So why can't we get it right?
Well, we can. We act like this is such a highfalutin thing. I've been part of this whole broadband discussion. You know, I designed a national broadband plan. That was one of the first things I did when I joined telecom. And everybody said, oh, this is a great plan. But, you know, it just never moved. So one of the things you can do is that, you know, government keeps messing around with this stuff and then it relies on its own institutions, which it really shouldn't because they don't have the same capability. We've got an incredibly capable private sector. And since I joined telecom, if not before, 100 flowers have bloomed. So there are, you know, it's a highly competitive environment. There are loads and loads of startups and loads of innovation in the area. What I was saying before I left, anyway, I left telecom in 2016 and I was talking to the budget office at Treasury. And, you know, really, if government can be a key driver of these things, but they should treat it as an operating expense. They tend to treat it as they treat it like a capital expense. But the reality is if you were a big corporate and you came to telecom or Vodacom or whatever and you said, we need to be hooked up, we don't charge you for the capital expense. We charge you for the service, and then we amortize the capital within that charge, right? So, mostly. And so what we said was, why don't you just take it out of the capital budget? Because unfortunately, I'm going to get shot for this, but the department's not going to be able to cope with broadband rollout, quite frankly. It's just going too slow. It's not going to happen. And it's not something you can wait for. As you might know, being in communications yourself, communications is everything for people. People care more about being connected than they almost care about food, right? That's just, surveys will tell you that. It's an obvious point. Markets depend on it. People depend on it for everything. It's the most fundamental thing, and people are getting cut out of communication if they're not online. It is an incredible enabler, especially when you have an urban configuration like we do, or spatial configuration where people are very far from opportunity. So it could be a game changer, and that's what I was talking to Arise about. We were talking about small business stimulation across Africa. There's no doubt. Digital connection, people think it's such a highfalutin thing, but it is a fantastic African solution that deals with the fact that people are all across Africa. People are very far from distance. They have very poor market information. There are small addressable markets for that reason. Digital connection is everything now in solving these issues. It's not, and we treat it like a luxury, and we have to change our mindset around that. Now, one of the things around that is human capability. It means that we could right now have at least 80% of the population online, but maybe 33% currently access the internet. Now, that's a very common problem, but it's much deeper across Africa than it is in the rest of the world. So if you were in Asia, that figure would be about 60%. have access to the internet. Also, our populations tend to mainly engage with social media and aren't deep users. They're not what's called meaningful users. Now, if I can give an example of what the problem is, I mentor a lot of young people. I'm very involved in youth leadership work. And amongst that, I have some young people that I mentor. And I'm just going to refer to one guy who, he's from an informal settlement. He's made his way to be a graduate at UCT in math and statistics. I mean, so that's the kind of person we're talking about. He might also shoot me if he knows talking about him, but he's an extraordinary, think about it. Coming from an informal settlement in Gauteng and finishing a math and stats degree at UCT is think about it, right?
No, it's an astonishing accomplishment. It is.
It really is. And I often have to remind him that it is really astonishing, and it says a lot about a character like that. But, I got to tell you, so he had a lot of friends who were in math and engineering, and I helped group them in Gauteng. I took them over to Chimologong at WITS when Barry was still alive, Dwalatsky, and they could see, it's a software engineering hub. And I wanted them to open their minds because they were thinking about going to university. They were all from disadvantaged backgrounds and all in an engineering or science track. Now, they would say, how is robotics relevant in Africa? They don't know anything about big data. It's unbelievable. And they're from Ekurhuleni, right, which is very central, right? They're not from a rural area. Mm. They all have smartphones, of course. They're all on an engineering track, but they don't know what big data is. So they're not connected into, it's just, it's a very abstract idea. What's the cloud? Right? It's so abstract, but so central to life now. People just aren't. Now, how can guys who are math-orientated, science-orientated, they're on the way to university from disadvantaged backgrounds, but they don't know what big data is? So, what I found was that psychologically, one of the ways I was mentoring him is I would get him once a month to write a little report about this company or that company or different applications that he might find interesting, because he had to fast track his understanding of basically having no concept of what big data is. Do you know what I mean by that? I'm using that as an...
No, keep going.
So, because he needs to internalize what it means so that he can get into that world and start accessing those opportunities for work. Because he's learning coding, he's doing computer science, he's doing all these things, but he doesn't get it, right? He does now, but...
That's a very good example and a very useful metaphor if that approach would be replicated exponentially. And I'm also glad, Miriam, by the way, that you referenced Professor Barry Dwalatsky, a personal friend of mine as well, and such a contribution he made towards fixing South Africa as well. Miriam, this has been a very quick 20 minutes, and I've got about 2 or 3 minutes left on the discussion, and I need to squeeze in 2 more questions. And again, I'm going to pivot in a different direction now. I mentioned in my introduction that you're also known as a social activist. As someone in that space, what role do you see for social activism or increased social activism in pushing for change, in pushing for the fix?
So I think if there's anything that has to happen, that's what needs to happen. If we want to see accountability in public delivery and start seeing the dial move, we have to be rebuilding is the thing, the social justice movement and civic action. And also business has to get stronger, which it is. And that is starting to happen. I'm involved in the water space at the very moment. I'm working with the DG of, Sean Phillips, DG of Water and Sanitation, another great leader, and the minister also, real servant leadership qualities. And, what I've learned in that process, I'm meant to bring stakeholders around to try to look at Gauteng water security. And what I've learned in the process is there's some phenomenal activism going on in Johannesburg, around the Johannesburg Crisis Alliance, and some fantastic people who are coming around and putting together well thought out demands and getting residents organized around critical things around electricity shortages and the very deep issues that are happening around water in a very sophisticated way. And I've been just so heartened to see this stuff emerging. As you know, after 94, a lot of these organizations fell down because a lot of that money went into the state. And now I'm finding that those organizations are rebuilding. then equally, what I'm involved in right now personally, this isn't work, this is like my own, like what I'm involved in, is youth leadership, as I was saying. And what I'm doing is I started an initiative around 2016, and we piloted in 2019. I work with an organization called Enke Make Your Mark. It's a youth leadership organization. And basically the idea is to build from a high school level. So we work with grade 8s to grade 11s, and we work with elected leadership in the high schools, and they have to lead the education change. So they become the change agents in education improvement, and through in their schools, and through that they build civic leadership capabilities.
Miriam, I'm going to ask you one final question. We've covered skills development. We've looked at the importance of the digital realm. We've spoken about activism. Pull all of it together for me in conclusion. And let me ask you this one very simple question. Do you believe in the short term South Africa can be fixed?
What a minefield question. It's not how I would have asked it. South Africa can't be fixed in the short term. This is a long haul story. But what the telecom story should tell you is telecom turned around. Nobody believed that telecom could be turned around. And we turned it around, whatever its issues are today, but we had a good 10-year run of a turnaround, which is a good turnaround. It moved very, very quickly within months. And the key to that was that commitment to capability, leadership, performance. That element of things is the most important. It's more important than exactly what you do. It's that people believe the change can happen, that they're roped into it, that they're energized by it, and that you've got strong leadership keeping that stream of activity consistent. The telecom change should be a very good example of how quickly things could improve. It won't be fixed, but the whole point is to get onto a path of continuous improvement and continuous learning, that we get onto that path that creates the hope and that creates a dynamism and a psychological boost.
Dr. Miriam Altman, I think after this conversation, to quote you from an earlier part of this dialogue, you have lit a fire, I hope, certainly under my bum and lots of other people as well. So thank you very, very much for joining me on the Fix SA podcast right here on Moneyweb. It's been a real pleasure, and goodbye to you. Thanks for listening to this Fix SA podcast. For more episodes posted every second Friday, go to moneyweb.co.za, the Moneyweb app, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or follow Moneyweb News on social media for more updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.